John was a man who had always preferred the quiet life. His ranch was tucked away in a valley surrounded by hills and thick forests, where the sound of the wind rustling through the trees was often the only thing that broke the silence. The sky was always so clear out here, the stars lighting up the night like diamonds scattered across a black velvet blanket. John had never minded the solitude. In fact, he had grown to love it over the years. Before the quietness of the land became his only companion, there was Mary. She had been his wife for over 15 years, and during that time the ranch had felt like a home. They would spend hours together working on the land, caring for the animals and enjoying each other's company. Her laughter would fill the rooms of the house, and the smell of her cooking would always linger in the air, giving the ranch a warmth that no amount of cold wind could ever drive away. But that warmth was gone now. Mary had passed away several years ago, and since then the ranch had felt different. The silence was louder, the emptiness more pronounced. It wasn't just the quiet that had changed John's life. It was the loss of the one person who had made him feel alive. Without her, everything seemed harder. The long days spent under the sun, the evenings alone with only his thoughts, all of it had become a routine that he could no longer escape. John wasn't a man who easily shared his feelings with others. He never had been. He'd learned early on that the world didn't always offer comfort when you needed it, so he kept to himself, burying his grief in the work of the ranch. The cattle needed tending, the fields needed plowing, and the fences were always in need of repair. Every day John worked from dawn until dusk, using the physical labor to push away the sadness that lingered in the back of his mind. But as time went on, the emptiness of the house began to feel like a weight on his shoulders. His old friends from the town would stop by occasionally, offering their condolences when they first heard the news of Mary's death. Over the years, though, they stopped coming as often. They had their own lives, their own families, and John understood that. He didn't blame them. He didn't blame anyone. But the truth was he was alone. The loneliness didn't always hit him right away. During the day he stayed busy, but in the quiet of the night, when the stars hung low and the fire in the hearth began to die down, that's when the silence became unbearable. He would sit in his chair by the fire, staring into the flames, remembering the way Mary's smile had lit up her face. He could still hear her voice sometimes in the wind outside, and it would pull at his heart, a reminder of what he had lost. John had never been one to dwell on things. He believed in getting on with life no matter the hardship. So that's exactly what he did. But as the years went by, the pain of losing Mary had faded into something more like a dull ache. It was always there, just beneath the surface, but it didn't stop him from doing what needed to be done. Life on the ranch went on, whether he was happy or not. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills and the sky turned a soft shade of pink, John finished his work for the day. He had just fed the cattle and checked on the barn, making sure everything was in order before heading inside for the night. His legs ached from the long hours, and the cold wind that blew in from the north had started to bite at his skin. He pulled his jacket tighter around himself and started walking back to the house. But then something caught his attention. In the distance, down the dusty road that led to his ranch, he saw a cloud of dust rising into the air. At first, he thought it might be another herd of cattle passing by, or perhaps a farmer making his way to the nearby town. But as the dust grew thicker, John realized it was something else entirely. A group of wagons moving slowly toward him. Curious, he stopped in his tracks. It wasn't common for people to pass through this part of the valley, especially not at this time of evening. He watched as the wagons got closer, the sound of the wheels creaking on the dry ground growing louder with each passing moment. It wasn't until the wagons were just a few hundred yards away that John finally started walking toward them. As he got closer, he saw a group of women traveling with the wagons. There were 4 of them, each one dressed in simple yet elegant clothing. Their faces were tired but determined, and their eyes seemed to hold stories John could only imagine. At the front of the group was an older woman leading the way. She was the first to notice John approaching and gave him a weary but kind smile. "Evening, sir," she called out, her voice soft but clear in the quiet evening air. "We're traveling through and we're hoping to find a place to rest for the night." "We didn't expect to find a ranch out here." John nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the group. There was something about them that struck him as different, something that stirred a feeling he hadn't had in a long time. Maybe it was the sadness in their eyes, or perhaps it was the weariness of their journey. Whatever it was, it reminded him of the loneliness he had grown so accustomed to. "I've got a bed inside and plenty of food. You're welcome to stay for the night," John said, his voice gruff but sincere. The woman smiled again, this time with more warmth. "Thank you. That's very kind of you." John stepped aside, gesturing for them to follow him up the dirt road to the ranch. As they made their way toward the house, he couldn't help but notice the way the women carried themselves. There was an air of strength about them, despite the sadness that seemed to surround them. They were travelers, survivors of some kind of hardship, and John felt an unexpected connection to them. As they entered the house, the warmth from the fire greeted them, and for the first time in years, John didn't feel quite so alone. The women stepped into John's home, and a wave of warmth from the crackling fire greeted them. It wasn't much, just a simple room with a few chairs, a wooden table, and a shelf lined with old books. But it was enough. As the door closed behind them, the sound of the wind outside seemed to vanish. The ranch, usually so quiet and empty, suddenly felt alive again. John motioned toward the fire, offering them a seat. "Make yourselves comfortable. I've got a stew simmering on the stove if you're hungry. It's nothing fancy, but it should fill you up." The women smiled gratefully, and one of them, the older woman who had spoken to him first, nodded. "Thank you, sir. We're grateful for your kindness." John wasn't used to having guests, especially not women. Over the years, the ranch had been a place of solitude, and his conversations had mostly been with cattle and the few farmers who lived miles away. But something about these women made him feel at ease. They weren't here to ask for much, just a place to rest after their long journey. And yet, their presence filled the house with a quiet energy that John hadn't realized he had been missing. As the women settled by the fire, John noticed the fatigue in their eyes. They had clearly been traveling for a long time, and the road had taken its toll on them. Despite their tiredness, there was a sense of strength in the way they carried themselves. John couldn't help but wonder about their story. The woman who had first spoken to him, whose name was Ruth, caught his gaze. She had dark hair streaked with gray, and a gentle expression that seemed to hold many secrets. She was sitting with the others around the fire, her hands folded in her lap. John saw a sadness in her eyes, a kind of quiet sorrow that seemed to match the silence in the house. "Where are you all headed?" John asked, trying to break the silence. Not many people pass through these parts. Ruth looked up, her gaze distant for a moment as though she were choosing her words carefully. "We're heading west," she said softly. "There's a town over the hills where we hope to find work. But the road has been long, and we've had our share of trouble along the way." John nodded, understanding more than she knew. Life on the ranch could be tough, especially when the weather was unpredictable and the land didn't always yield what you hoped. But there was something more in her tone, something that hinted at a deeper struggle. John didn't press further, though. He wasn't one to pry into others' lives. They would tell him what they wanted in their own time. One of the younger women, a blonde with striking blue eyes, spoke up. "I'm Emma," she said, her voice full of warmth. "We're just grateful for your hospitality. We've been traveling for so long, and it's hard to keep going without a place to rest." John smiled and nodded. "It's no trouble. You're welcome to stay as long as you need." The other two women introduced themselves as well, Clara and Hannah. Clara was a quiet woman with long red hair that she kept tied back in a loose braid, while Hannah, the youngest of the group, had a bright smile that seemed to light up the room. John could see that each woman had her own personality, but they shared a bond, something unspoken that connected them all. As the evening wore on, John set the table with bowls of stew and bread. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the scent of the food filled the room. The women sat around the table, eating in silence at first, each of them clearly relieved to be off the road. But as they ate, the conversation began to flow more easily. Ruth spoke of the loss of her husband, a man who had worked alongside her for years before a sudden illness took him from her. "I never thought I'd be alone," she said quietly, looking down at her bowl. "We had plans, dreams of growing old together on our farm, but that all changed in the blink of an eye." Emma nodded sympathetically. "My husband died in a fire," she said. "It wasn't expected. He was a strong man, and the fire, it took everything from us in one night." Clara's voice was soft, almost a whisper. "I lost my husband in an accident. One minute he was there, and the next he was gone. I didn't even get to say goodbye." Hannah, who had been quiet up until now, spoke next. "I'm not sure what happened to my husband," she said. "I never got to see him again after he left for work. They told me he'd been killed, but I never found out the truth, and now I'm left wondering what happened to him." John listened quietly, his heart heavy with their stories. He had never lost anyone like that, not in the way they had, but he could feel the pain in their words. The sorrow was in their eyes, in the way they held themselves. They were all women who had suffered, each in her own way. And yet, despite everything they had been through, they had not given up. They were still here, still fighting to survive. As the night wore on, the conversation shifted to lighter topics, memories of better days, stories of the towns they had passed through, and the strange things they had encountered on their travels. The laughter that filled the room was something John hadn't heard in a long time. It felt good, like the warmth of the fire that seemed to fill every corner of the house. Eventually, the fire began to die down, and the women started preparing to settle in for the night. They made up their beds on the floor by the fire, using blankets and quilts they had brought with them. John, feeling the weight of the day's work catching up with him, excused himself and went to his room. As he lay down, he thought about what had just happened, how these women had come into his life so suddenly, how their stories had touched him, and how, for the first time in years, he didn't feel so alone. As he drifted off to sleep, the sound of the wind outside seemed softer, almost comforting. The ranch no longer felt as empty as it had before. The women had brought something with them, something he hadn't realized he needed. And as John lay there, listening to the quiet of the night, he wondered if perhaps this visit would lead to something more. Maybe, just maybe, his lonely days were over. The morning light filtered through the cracks in the wooden walls, casting a soft golden glow on the room. John had already been awake for a while, lying in bed, listening to the sounds of the women stirring in the main room. The air was fresh with the scent of earth and hay, and the soft hum of the wind outside seemed to have calmed overnight. As John got up and stretched, he could hear the sound of pots and pans clinking, and the soft murmur of voices coming from the kitchen. The women were already up preparing breakfast. It was strange, but John felt a sense of comfort in the sounds. For so long the ranch had been quiet, its silence broken only by the calls of the birds or the rustle of the trees. But now there was a bustle, a life to the house that hadn't been there before. When he stepped into the main room, he was greeted by the sight of the women working together, setting up the table with a simple yet hearty breakfast. The smell of fresh-baked bread and sizzling bacon filled the air. For a moment it felt like any ordinary morning, except it wasn't. There were 4 women, strangers just the night before, now making themselves at home. "Good morning," Ruth said with a warm smile as she noticed John entering. "We've got eggs and bread ready. I hope you don't mind a bit of company." John shook his head and smiled in return. "No, I don't mind at all. It's nice to have company again." The other women, who were busy with the cooking, all paused for a moment to glance up at him. Emma, who had the most lively spirit, grinned. "It's nice to be here. I can't remember the last time I slept so soundly." She placed a plate of eggs and bacon on the table. "You have a beautiful place, John." John sat down at the table, feeling a bit awkward at first. He wasn't used to the attention, nor was he used to being surrounded by women who were so lively and engaging. But as he took a bite of the food, the warmth from the fire and the comfort of the meal eased his nerves. He hadn't realized how much he had missed conversation, real, meaningful conversation, the kind that filled the silence and made you forget about the quiet for a while. After breakfast, the women began to clean up and get ready to leave. The sun had risen high and the day was already turning warm. They had a long journey ahead, but they needed a moment to rest before they continued on the road. As they packed their things, Ruth approached John with a thoughtful expression on her face. "John," she began, her voice softer now, "we don't mean to impose, but would it be possible for us to stay another night?" John was surprised by the request. He had expected them to leave after breakfast, as they had made it clear the night before that they were just passing through. But there was something in Ruth's voice, something vulnerable yet strong, that made him hesitate. He could tell they had been through hardships, and though he didn't know the full story, he understood that a night's rest could make all the difference. "Of course," he said after a pause. "I don't mind at all. You're welcome to stay as long as you need." Ruth smiled gratefully, her eyes softening with relief. "Thank you. We don't want to trouble you, but we've been on the road for so long. It's been hard, and it feels good to be here, even if it's just for a little while." As the day stretched on, John found himself spending more time with the women than he had intended. After a long day of work on the ranch, he would sit with them by the fire in the evenings. They would share stories, laugh at silly things, and sometimes fall into moments of quiet reflection. There was something about their presence that made John feel alive again, something he hadn't realized he had been missing. Clara, who had been quiet the first night, began to open up as the days passed. She spoke of her time back home, of the ranch she and her husband had run together before his sudden death. Her voice trembled at times, but she carried on, sharing memories of better days. "We had cattle and a little farm, just like you," she told John one evening. "It was peaceful. We worked hard, but it was our life. It's funny how much you take for granted until it's gone." John nodded, understanding the truth in her words. It was the same for him. When Mary had been alive, everything had felt so certain. They had worked together, planned for the future, and shared the little joys of everyday life. But now it was all just memories. The silence, the emptiness, it was something he had learned to live with. But it never quite felt the same. Over the next few days, the women's presence began to feel less like an interruption and more like a comfort. John found himself looking forward to their company. They had settled into a routine. John would work on the ranch during the day, and the women would help with small tasks around the house. It was nothing extraordinary, but it was enough to make the house feel fuller. The days more meaningful. Emma, always the energetic one, was quick to offer a helping hand, whether it was cleaning the barn or tending to the garden. "You've got a good place here," she said one afternoon, wiping her brow as she worked beside John. "A man could do a lot with land like this. You just need someone to help you." John didn't know what to say. He had been doing it all on his own for so long that the thought of anyone else sharing the work seemed foreign. But as he watched Emma with her bright eyes and endless energy, he couldn't help but smile. Maybe there was more to life than working alone, than being self-sufficient all the time. Later that evening, as the sun set behind the hills, John found himself sitting with the women around the fire once again. This time there was no rush to leave, no sense of hurry. They had settled in, and the night felt warmer, cozier than it had in a long time. The conversation turned to lighter things, funny stories, silly accidents, and the little joys of life. It was easy to laugh, easy to forget about the past for a while. As John listened to their stories, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The women, with their strength and resilience, had brought something back to his life that he thought was lost forever. The silence, the loneliness, it wasn't gone, but it didn't feel so heavy now. The future seemed less uncertain. Perhaps he thought things could be different. And for the first time in a long time, John allowed himself to think that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. As the days passed, the women continued to stay at John's ranch, and their presence began to feel like a natural part of his daily life. The once quiet and empty house now hummed with activity. John found himself getting used to the sound of laughter, of voices filling the air, and even the soft clatter of dishes being washed or clothes being mended. It was a change, but it was a change that felt right. The work on the ranch continued, of course. John still had his responsibilities, and the land didn't take a break just because there were guests in the house. But somehow, with the women helping out, things seemed to flow more smoothly. Emma, always the energetic one, offered to help with the chores. She'd sweep the floors, scrub the dishes, and even tended to the small garden outside, pulling weeds and planting new seeds. John couldn't help but be impressed by her energy and enthusiasm. It had been so long since he'd had someone to share the work with, and it felt good. Clara, who had been more reserved at first, began to open up more as the days went on. She would sit with John in the evenings by the fire, sharing stories about her past. She talked about her husband, who had been a good man, kind and hard-working, and how they had built their ranch together just as John had done. There was a sense of warmth in her words, and as John listened, he found himself connecting with her more deeply than he had expected. "She was always so proud of the land we had," Clara said one evening, her voice soft as she gazed into the fire. "But more than that, she loved the simple things. The mornings when we'd sit together drinking coffee, watching the sun come up. The way the wind would carry the scent of the earth. It was those small moments that made life feel so full." John nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He understood. It was the small moments that he missed the most. Those moments when life felt simple and peaceful. The ranch had once been filled with those moments when Mary was alive. And now, listening to Clara, John realized that those moments didn't have to be gone forever. Perhaps they could return in a different way. But it wasn't just Clara who was starting to make an impact on John's life. Ruth, the older woman who had first spoken to him when they arrived, had a quiet wisdom about her. She didn't say much, but when she did, her words always seemed to carry weight. John often caught himself listening carefully when she spoke, sensing that she understood things in a way that he couldn't quite grasp. She had been through so much, and yet she carried herself with grace and dignity. One afternoon, Ruth came to John as he was finishing up with the cattle. She had been watching him from the porch, and when he finished his work, she walked up to him, her steps slow but purposeful. "You know, John," she began, her voice steady, "there's more to life than just surviving. We've all been through hardships, yes. We've all lost people we loved. But that doesn't mean we stop living. We keep moving forward. And sometimes that means allowing ourselves to find happiness again." John looked at her, her words sinking in. He hadn't realized it before, but he had been living in a kind of survival mode since Mary passed away. He had buried his grief, working endlessly to avoid facing the emptiness. But Ruth's words made him wonder if there was more to life than just keeping busy, more to life than just getting by. "I never thought about it that way," John said, his voice quieter than usual. "I guess I've just been lost since Mary died. I don't know how to move on." Ruth smiled softly, placing a hand on his arm. "You don't have to move on all at once, John. It's not about forgetting. It's about finding a way to keep living even in the face of loss. That's what we all have to do. We're still here, aren't we?" John nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling on him. He didn't have all the answers, but Ruth was right. He was still here, and maybe it was time to start living again, even if it was in a way he hadn't imagined. The following days were filled with more work and more moments of connection. The women continued to help around the ranch, but they also shared stories, laughter, and even some light-hearted moments. One evening, as they sat outside, the sun dipping low in the sky, the women began to talk about their travels, about the places they had been and the people they had met. They spoke of the hardships they had faced, but also of the beauty they had seen in the world, even in the midst of loss. "It's strange," Emma said, her voice thoughtful as she stared out at the horizon. "You go through so much, and yet the world keeps turning. People keep going, moving forward. I used to think that if I lost my husband, I'd never be able to live again. But here I am, still going." John looked at her, surprised by the strength in her words. He had never thought of it that way. He had always thought that grief was something you had to carry forever, like a heavy burden. But here were these women, each one carrying their own pain, yet still finding a way to move forward, to find meaning in their lives again. For the first time in a long time, John felt a spark of hope. Maybe he too could find a way to live again, even if it meant starting over, even if it meant learning to let go of the past. As the days turned into weeks, the women's presence on the ranch began to feel like a blessing. They brought joy, laughter, and a sense of community that John had been missing for so long. It wasn't that he had forgotten about Mary, he never could. But with each passing day, he began to realize that it was possible to cherish the past and still move forward. Life wasn't about forgetting. It was about finding a way to carry the good memories with you while embracing the possibilities that lay ahead. And as the fire burned low that evening, with the women gathered around, John felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He had come to accept that life would never be the same as it once was, but that didn't mean it couldn't still be beautiful. As the weeks passed, John's life began to take on a new rhythm, one that he hadn't expected when the women first arrived at his ranch. They were no longer just guests passing through. They had become a part of his daily existence, and he found that he looked forward to their company more than he had anticipated. The ranch, once a place of solitude, now buzzed with life. The sound of laughter, the rustle of women working in the fields, and the quiet hum of conversation filled the air. The women continued to help with the ranch work, but they also brought with them a sense of joy that John hadn't realized he had been missing. It wasn't just the physical help that made a difference, it was their presence, their ability to bring warmth into his life, that truly changed things. One afternoon, John found himself standing on the porch, watching as Ruth, Emma, Clara, and Hannah worked together in the garden. They were digging, planting seeds and laughing, their voices carrying in the breeze. John couldn't help but smile as he watched them. It was hard to imagine that just a few weeks ago the ranch had been empty, its silence weighing on him like a heavy fog. Now it felt like home again. Ruth looked up and caught his eye. She smiled, and there was something in her expression that made John pause. She had always been quiet, but there was a depth to her that he admired. She had seen so much in her life, and yet she carried herself with grace, never complaining, never asking for anything more than what she needed. She had become more than just a guest to him. She had become a friend, someone he could trust, someone who understood what it meant to carry pain and still keep moving forward. "You're looking thoughtful, John," Ruth said, wiping her hands on her apron as she approached him. "What's on your mind?" John hesitated for a moment before answering. "I was just thinking about how much has changed since you all came here." It's different now in a good way." Ruth nodded, her gaze softening. "It's the same for us. We came here looking for rest, but I think we found something more than that. I think we found a place where we can start over." John's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't realized until that moment how much he had needed the change, how much he had needed their presence. For so long he had been stuck in the past, living in the shadows of his memories. But now, with the women here, he was starting to see that it was possible to move forward, to find peace in the present. Later that evening, after a simple dinner of stew and bread, the group sat outside by the fire. The stars were bright above, and the cool night air had a peaceful, calming effect. John sat back in his chair, looking at the flames as they danced in the fire pit. The warmth from the fire reached him, but it was the warmth of the company around him that really made him feel alive again. Emma, who had become the most talkative of the group, was telling one of her favorite stories, laughing as she recounted a funny mishap from their travels. The others joined in, their laughter ringing out into the night. It was a sound that John had almost forgotten, and it filled his heart with a sense of joy he hadn't felt in years. As the evening wore on, the conversation turned quieter. The women spoke about their hopes for the future, about the things they dreamed of now that they had a place to rest. They spoke of rebuilding their lives, of starting anew, and of finding happiness in the simple things. For the first time in a long time, John found himself thinking about his own future, not just about surviving, but about what he could still achieve. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," Clara said softly, her voice carrying in the night air. "When I lost my husband, I thought that was it. I didn't think I could ever be happy again. But somehow being here, being with all of you, I'm starting to see that life doesn't end when we lose someone we love." John felt a lump in his throat as he listened. He had thought the same thing when Mary died, that his life was over, that there was no more purpose. But now, sitting here with these women, he realized that life could go on. It didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean erasing the past. But it did mean finding a way to live again, even after loss. As the fire burned low, Ruth stood up and walked over to John. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch gentle but firm. "You've been so kind to us, John. You've given us more than just a place to stay. You've given us a chance to heal, to find hope again. I can't thank you enough for that." John looked up at her, surprised by the sincerity in her words. He hadn't thought about it that way. He had simply opened his door to them, offered them a bed for the night, and over time they had all become part of his life. But in doing so, they had given him something in return, something he hadn't realized he needed. "I didn't do anything special," John said, his voice quiet but sincere. "I just did what anyone would do." Ruth smiled, her eyes full of understanding. "Sometimes just being there for someone is the most important thing you can do. And you've done that for us, John. You've given us a place to rest, but more importantly, you've shown us that there's still kindness in the world." The word stayed with John long after the fire had burned out, long after the women had gone to bed. He lay in his own bed that night, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. He realized that in his quiet, solitary way, he had found something precious, something he had thought was lost forever. The next morning when John woke up, he felt different. He felt like he had a reason to get out of bed, like there was something to look forward to. The sun was shining, the air was crisp, and the ranch seemed alive with possibility. As he walked out to join the women for breakfast, he smiled, realizing that he was no longer alone. The emptiness he had felt for so long had been filled, not by a single person, but by the shared kindness and connection he had found with the women. John knew that there would be challenges ahead, that life would never be without its hardships, but for the first time in years he felt ready to face them. He had learned that healing didn't happen overnight, that it took time, patience, and the willingness to open your heart again. But he also knew that with the women by his side he was no longer walking alone, and as he sat down at the table with them, ready to begin another day of work, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The kind of hope that comes from knowing that even after loss, life can still be full, still be beautiful, and still be worth living.